Next up, we have David Dietrich with University of Washington talking about anti-botnet measures.
Okay, thanks to the NANOG program committee for allowing me to talk to you guys today. And the slides are, I don't think I've put them up on the URL here, but I will have these and some other resources up in a little bit. So I'm going to be talking about, there have been a bunch of people wanting to take down botnets for various reasons. What are those reasons? So what are some ways that we should be thinking about doing this, since things seem to be escalating in a number of different ways? What is it that we need to do as a community differently to be more effective, to up our game a little bit? We're not going to have enough time to go through the case studies, but I have some here in case people have some questions. They kind of may come up in the middle. And there's a write-up paper that I did at LEAT, I believe it was 2012. I'll make it available in this directory that has a little bit more detail on these case studies. So how many people here have some frustration at the amount of malware that's out there and people doing things, especially things that last for multiple years? You get a lot of people saying law enforcement's not doing anything for us, and starting to say, why do I even go to report to them? They're not helping. I should have some kind of a right to self-defense. And from a user perspective, Kaspersky put up a poll, and this is completely not scientific, but 85% of the people responding to the question, we sinkhold Kelios, we control them, what should we do with them? 85% said you should push code and clean those machines up. For those of you that, this is the Kelios botnet takedown in 2012. How many people here read the blog post that came out? Kind of talked about what's the architecture, et cetera. Had a very interesting set of information at the very end. What should we do? And obviously you can't read this. What should we do? We need to put people behind bars. That's the only way this is going to stop. In order for us to do that, we need to be granted the right to take over botnets and use them in investigations. We need to be given exemptions from things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act so that we're not held liable if we cause damage to systems. We need to be given warrants or special powers, kind of quasi-law enforcement, to allow us to go do investigations using these stolen resources. And they again say, well, the public wants this too. We did this poll, it says 84% want us to go clean these machines up. So that argument is coming out more and more. And if you're going to start thinking about doing things that are more aggressive, there are a bunch of ethical standards and norms that guide us. How many people here are members of IEEE or ACM? Okay. How many of those who raise their hands kind of think about the code of ethics on a daily basis for guiding the way that they make decisions? And I'll get to some of the reasons why you probably do in a minute. For those of you that work in universities who are doing what's known as human subjects research, there are laws that guide these things called institutional review boards. They're called research ethics boards in some other countries. And there's also this, if you're going to talk about, I have a right to self-defense, somebody's hitting me, I should be able to hit them back. There are the laws of armed conflict that control how nation states or sovereign nations interact with each other in a defensive way. And Ken Hima and I documented some workshops that were done by this group called the Agora in Seattle, where we came up with this thing we're calling the active response continuum. And what are the ethical principles, necessity, defense, et cetera, that you would apply if you were justifying using force in self-defense? And then people who work in corporate environments may have some guidelines that your institution requires. And again, this is one of the things that you probably won't be able to read, but it's divided up into 3 sections. The top section are the societal codes, defense, necessity, et cetera. And you shouldn't be trying to punish somebody That's law enforcement's job. We grant, in countries where we have constitutional forms of government, we grant the government the right to go find people and punish people. And retribution, going out and just harm for harm's sake to make up for something else that somebody else did, those are not ethically justifiable things. The middle section are the professional codes, and the one thing that probably everybody in here knows internally on a daily basis, you're given data in trust, you don't disclose it, and if you are going to use data, you get permission from someone, and if they want attribution, they get attribution. You don't claim what you came up with is yours when you actually got it from somebody else. Those are the ethical norms that most people adhere to on a daily basis. At the bottom are the academic codes. The one thing that's most important there, for the context of the discussion we're having, is people have a right to autonomy. They can make their own decisions, and if their machines are going to be cleaned up, they should be the ones saying, yes, go ahead and clean this thing up, or having some control of that. You can't just go do something to somebody else's computer because you think that they're not capable of it or they're not smart enough or whatever. So this active response continuum thing, there are various levels of capability or understanding that people have about security and defensive mechanisms and how to clean up and mitigate things. So at the very bottom, you have the people that just absolutely know nothing. You know, the grandparents that buy a computer or they're given one and like they know nothing. What we operate on most of the time in this community is level 3. You have skills, if somebody tells you there's a compromised machine, you know what to do about it, and you work cooperatively by sharing information with other people. You clean up your area, they clean up their area, you communicate, try and clean the whole thing up. It's level 4 where there's a problem. And that's where you're starting to do things that are reaching out into other people's networks that might be considered a use of force in some context, and potentially are the retaliation sort of things. When we were discussing this, we realized, well, level 4 even has multiple levels, and you have to kind of think about it. It goes from being less intrusive to more intrusive, less noticeable or harmful, less risky. And you really need to be capable of justifying what it is that you're doing, because what you're doing might be illegal in your country, in the country where the computer is that you're dealing with. And you should try at least to go through this in some sort of a progressive way, working as much as you can towards cooperation, reporting to people, making sure that they do their thing, and not just jumping to automatic strike back or counter-strike. We prefer the phrase active response continuum because it sort of stresses there is a continuum, there is a range of things, and you need to consider everything along that range. Now, what is the easiest thing to do, the least intrusive and least sort of disruptive, is just the collecting intelligence thing. And people poke around if you know that there's a system that's controlling a bunch of infected hosts or putting out malware. You might poke at it, try and figure out, can you get some information out of it? It's when you start getting into the more disruptive things, and how many people here remember the Berman-Coble bill? MPAA and RIAA were asking for modifications to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to grant them, just the media industry, the right to find systems that are distributing copyright material, enter those systems and disable them. So shut off the network interface of a system in a peer-to-peer network that is sharing out a bunch of files. They didn't get that law passed, but every now and then people are asking, and right now there's a bunch of discussion about we need to modify the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to grant victims the right to do things, to go back and make the adversaries pay, make them stop because it's going to be too painful for them. So it just keeps coming around again and again. The main thing here is that all of these things involve doing things outside of your zone of authority without any cooperation of the people who own those or operate those resources. So if we're going to talk about dealing with botnets, and we'll get to the naming thing in a little bit, I mean, this is a notional graph, but it's fairly easy to just sandbox things, figure out how something talks to a command and control server, maybe get the password, etc. You can start using the passwords, start manipulating the botnet. It's when you start getting up to, I want to make that thing, all of those hundreds of thousands of computers go to my sinkhole and take them out of control of the bad guy, or go clean them up, that things get really complicated, really technical, and really risky. And I'm not seeing a lot of people understand that, you know, I've made it look like it's an exponential graph here. They think it's more of a linear thing and that it's not really that hard or not that risky, and I want to disabuse people of that thought. There's been a bunch of thought about this in various contexts, and the most recent paper that I've read that kind of looks at things in a little bit more complex way than we did with the active response continuum. Dorothy Denning was trying to use the DoD policy for active air and missile defense and just substitute the word cyber for air and missile and think through what DoD has thought about in terms of defensive mechanisms. And they clearly differentiate things that are active versus passive. So this whole active defense thing, some of the active defense things are honeypots. And is a honeypot active? Maybe, maybe not, but there's a bunch of argument about words, and we'll see that over and over in this talk. The 4 dimensions that she applies, she and Strausser, are the scope of effects. How far out do things go? What's the degree of cooperation? Because actually it's not just they cooperate or they don't cooperate. There are gradations of that. And then type of effects and the amount of automation. So how quickly does something happen? And if it's something like going out and automatically shutting off computers or things like that, the degree of automation, the speed, and the scope can combine and have really bad effects. They use some similar justifications under the law of war: defense, necessity, proportionality, non-combatant immunity. So you're not supposed to attack innocent civilians who are not even related at all to the conflict. And then you shouldn't be doing things that are retributive or retaliatory. You should be doing things in a self-defense mode when that is justifiable. There has been another effort that is more on the research context that's been going on for quite a while. I mean, how many people here have heard the word Menlo, or the words Menlo report, the name Menlo report? Only a very few. Okay. So DHS has had these series of workshops, and I and Aaron Keneally have been the lead authors on the documents that have been published. And the idea here is to try and take this institutional review board, human subjects evaluation mechanism, and apply it to information and communication technology research. So how do you get consent from users? How do you protect data? How do you choose subjects in a way that is fair and balanced, and how did the results get published in a way that balances benefits society in an equitable way? So these first 3 sets are the basic principles that are used by biomedical and behavioral researchers. The 4th one that we added, compliance with the law and public interest, is basic, or respect for the law and public interest, is basically trying to be very transparent about what it is that you're doing. The one thing that's the most beneficial here that I'm kind of bringing over into this whole talk is doing a comprehensive stakeholder analysis. You want to know, and this is a mechanism that's used by people in the software engineering field, as well as there's an association of social anthropologists in the UK that uses this methodology for understanding the delivery of aid to afflicted communities in various countries. And things can get really, really complicated. So you think about, first of all, primary stakeholders. They're the ones who you're trying to benefit. but there also can be negative stakeholders. If you're in an area that's under conflict and there is warring factions, things that you do, the aid might actually go to the bad guys rather than to the people you want to benefit. In our case, you publish some information about some malware vulnerability, the bad guys might use it to fix their malware. So you have to think about the whole range there. The secondary stakeholders are the intermediaries. So most of the people here that operate networks, it's not your computers that are affected, it's your customers' computers. Their malicious data is transiting your networks. And the key stakeholders are the ones that actually have an impact in the delivery of the benefits or the harms. So that includes the bad guys. I've now got 4 different examples of how to do this stakeholder analysis in a bunch of different contexts. One of them is remote mitigation of botnets with a couple of researchers from Germany. So if we're going to be trying to get more aggressive and go after these things, there's a bunch of things that we need to think about in order to do it the right way. First of all, we need to name things better and be a little bit more scientific about the way that we categorize things, have some kind of a taxonomy that makes sense, and not just come up with a new name just because we can claim first discovery of something that actually is something that's been around for a long time. And doing counts based on IP addresses and then calling those infections is terrible, because we all know IP addresses change. So if we can't count things accurately and can't explain how we count them, what good's the number? Other than making the number bigger than the last number that someone reported so that a reporter will actually take your questions and then publish something with your name in it. We need to start taking a much higher level view rather than just going after whatever we think is the thing right in front of us that's on fire. And actually be a little bit less competitive to make sure that we as a team are dealing with things and not just giving up to the bad guys. And part of this is about integrity, and a lot of people have their own definition of what integrity is. The definition that I use is the one that Stephen Carter came up with. You know right and wrong, you make your choices based on your understanding of right and wrong, even if that costs you in some way, and you should be able to, when somebody asks you about it, openly and clearly explain how you came to your decision. If you can't do that, and if it looks like it's a self-serving thing that you did, then people should be calling you on it. And as a community, we should be standing up a little bit more. When it comes to names, I now hate the name bot and botnet. It is so meaningless. And how many times do you see people say, oh, well, I found an infected machine on my network. Can somebody give me the IP of the CNC? Well, in a peer-to-peer network, there may be hundreds of thousands of what look like C2C. What's the difference between a remote file injection or RFI server and a dropper or a dropper framework? We've got just too many names. People keep coming up with these different names. Mothership. Is a mothership command and control server, or is it not a command and control server? Now we're starting to do that with adversaries. So we've got APT1, and we've got Comment Crew. Dell likes to name things based on the tools. CrowdStrike likes to name things based on where they claim the region is of the attacker. So if we're now using different names to talk about the same group, and we have tools, tactics, and procedures, or we have some information about campaign level activity over time, do we have 2 campaigns? Do we have 1 campaign? If you find some other victims and you go start talking to them and you use the wrong word, then they don't actually know what it is you're talking about. I had this happen one time with someone who first said, do you want to talk about Citadel? Okay, well, I haven't read about Citadel. I have absolutely no idea what Citadel is about. Well, it's a variant of Zeus. Okay, Zeus. I know what Zeus is about. Everything is clear. So just in a flash, you go from no knowledge at all to a great deal of knowledge, but we don't do that very well. Here's a little diagram of this multi-phase operation, which we often don't take into consideration. So here's a web server that has iframes. That's part of the browser infection. There may be a browser exploit kit that is part of a dropper framework that's there to try and exploit you. Once you're exploited, you now get code loaded, in this case, mebroot. So there's a rootkit. There's a command and control server for the configuration files. There's actually a caching server, which they call a Torpig CNC server. So there are dual roles there. One's controlling, one's receiving. And then an injection server, which is kind of the same thing as the vulnerable web server on the other side in some ways. And then you see another description of very similar things where that whole diagram that we just looked at is now the little grimacing email in the upper left. And now the browser exploit kit is called out specifically Zeus and cinject, which is the last point of the infection arm of the dropper, and multiple different browser exploits that are involved, and those can keep continuing. So those things are talking about the same different thing from two different perspectives, and you don't really see the commonality between them. And how many people here have heard Paul Vixie use this phrase, range of the moment? I didn't quite understand it at first. If you know geology, how much energy is released in an earthquake? Just enough energy to go back to equilibrium. So the range of the moment in an earthquake is the total amount of energy released. In this context, it's you see something, there's a command and control server there. Okay, to make the botnet stop, all I have to do is take the command and control server out, I do what I need to do, it's done. So just doing enough to solve whatever you think the immediate problem is in front of you is acting on the range of the moment. That's not working for us. That's whack-a-mole. So we need to be much more sophisticated about this if we're going to make this work. And here's what I'm talking about with taking the bigger view. If you look at the documents that we had on the HLUX or Kelios B sinkhole, there's a lot of information there about why it was done, who did it. There's a stakeholder analysis in there. And in our FAQ, we answer these questions about who are the stakeholders, et cetera. I'm going to kind of breeze through some of those because we're running out of time. So the botnet was taken down, and not long after that, within a couple of days, people were saying, well, it's not really down. I'm still seeing spam coming up. Well, was it taken down or was it not taken down? Here is a thing called Virate, which recently was explained or was announced to be promoting Wallodec. Wallodec is the name that Symantec uses for HLUX and Kelios. So they're claiming Wallodec is back when it's really Kelios. And looking at the Deep End Research website, there's this thing called Trojan Nap, which they say is Kelios and HLUX. They called it Trojan Nap because it delays for like 10 minutes when it does the infection to try and get around sandboxing. That's a technique that's been around since at least 2007. And there's a whole bunch of examples there of Kelios in action. And the malware must die people have a diagram that's similar to the diagram earlier that talks about the Kelios dropper, which really isn't the Kelios dropper. It's the framework used by the people who were doing the pay-per-install service that the Kelios people were using to get their code onto systems. And in this case, they're saying it's RedKit. So Wallodec, aka Kelios, that operator has used Conficker, 5sock, Virate, RedKit, and probably a couple other pay-per-install mechanisms to get their code onto people's systems. So we've known actually for years that it's not self-propagating, it's propagated by something else. To stop the propagation, you have to stop the other thing too. If you look at 5sock, which was acknowledged in the HoneyNet project blog as being the thing that was distributing HLUX in 2012, look at Microsoft's site. You see some names, WebKit, 5sock, here's some domains, ddk2200.com is one of them. If you go look for ddk2200.com, you find some websites. Here are some other virus names that are associated with it. And you find that the Dynamo website talks about the Liza Moon attack. What's Liza Moon? Liza Moon was SQL injection to inject iframes, to cause your browser to go to some place, to download a dropper, and DDK2200 shows up in their list. And Brian Krebs, who's been reporting on the guy that ran Wolodeck, Microsoft took Wolodeck down, went to court, got the name of the guy. Eventually, Microsoft got him to plead in court, yes, I wrote it. I'm not the operator, but I wrote it. And there's some IP addresses in there. So if you take all that data, it took me a few hours to put this thing together. You take all that data and you see how Twitter and Facebook users get spammed. The spam directs you to the browser inject. That gets code onto your host if your browser is vulnerable. It then installs WinWebSec. It drops Kelios. Those things do spamming to keep the thing going. And the little box in the upper left is the portion of the bots at the time of the sinkhole that were taken over. They were effectively sinkholed. But if you ignore all the propagation, within hours, they simply went out and bought some more, and they were back up and running. And now there's a little botnet version C down on the bottom, and the new variant basically only had new encryption keys and a couple of bug fixes that were in the pipeline. So the range of the moment solution didn't really take the whole thing down. They're back up and running. So we're not going to be able to go through the case studies, but I will run through them. And I just want to mention this one. So Mariposa, it had been around for a while. You can see it's got multiple names. I don't even think ZBot applies to this one because I don't really think it has anything to do with ZBot. But that was, the command and control was in a bulletproof hoster, and it was really hard to get that shut down. When the Mariposa working group did some things to try to take this over from the bad guys using uncooperative means or semi-cooperative, and I won't get into all the details of that. Suffice it to say that in the public documents that are out there, they lost control of part of the resource, the command and control resources, for a short period of time. The bad guy took it over, did a denial of service attack against who he thought was trying to take over his network. There were other people using the same networks as a network that was targeted. So innocent people suffered an outage because of this 900 megabit per second DDoS that lasted 8 to 12 hours. And it was an accident that the guy tripped up, didn't use his VPN, logged into one of the resources, they got an IP address, turned out to be something that he had registered or had used for registration of a domain at some point. That was given to the Spanish police. The Spanish police did arrest him. So if ends justify the means, and if you ignore the fact that there was this attack and it was kind of luck, you know, it's a success. The guy was arrested, but anybody who's going to go after a botnet operator in this kind of aggressive way from now on should know or should expect you might be attacked. So if you're going to use your own network, or if you're going to use a network to share with others, they may be affected. And if you're going to try and hide yourself by using somebody else's network, you're not going to get attacked, they're going to get attacked. So the whole comprehensive stakeholder analysis thing will help you think through the right way to go about doing all this stuff so that harm is minimized, benefits are maximized. So this is a summary. It's a little, this table is a little bit bigger than the one that's in my LEET paper. But if you look at this, there are a lot of major variances in the numbers that are quoted by various people trying to count these things. The length of time that some of these bots have been up, in some cases, the longest one there I think is Corefled, 10 years, supposedly that Corefled had been active. And there have been multiple takedown attempts on some of these. The ones that, when I first did this paper, I was trying to analyze, is using legal process, either criminal or civil legal process, in conjunction with technical means, something that will help get a better outcome? And it seemed like the answer was yes. And then people started reminding me, well, wait a second, so Kelios actually is Wolodeck. Wolodeck was a variant of Storm, or a precursor. Storm was a precursor to Wolodeck. So from that perspective, maybe when Microsoft first took it down, you can't call that a total success. But Microsoft has managed to get the guy who wrote it to plead in court, yes, I wrote it. The other takedown operations have not come up with those kinds of outcomes. So if the goal, as Kaspersky was saying in their blog, is to put people behind bars, we need to do things that will assist law enforcement in doing their job to put people behind bars. Just going out and doing it on our own might not be getting those effects. So the biggest thing is don't use IP addresses for counting, and don't claim that an IP address is an infection. There is a big incentive to inflate numbers. If you're a company and you provide services, you need some publicity, but everybody question numbers. Whenever somebody tells you something, ask, what's the counting methodology? How long did you count? And the reason for that is the time that the count takes place matters a huge amount. These guys have subsequently done a paper, I'm forgetting the name of the paper. They've been looking at a bunch of different peer-to-peer bots, and they did counts of each one of them. So just take a look at this graph. This is the first 5 days or 6 days of the 2012 Kelios takedown, the sinkhole numbers. The red line in the bottom that has this little wavy diurnal pattern is the number of hosts connected during that short window, 1 minute or whatever. And it goes up and down because there's a certain place in the world where the greatest number of infections are. That's the peak. The green line is the number of unique IDs of infected hosts connecting to the sinkhole. So it's only going to go up if it's a new one that they've never seen. And the blue line that has a similar wave to it, that has a much higher growth rate, is the total number of IPs seen connecting to the sinkhole over time. So if you notice, they're close to in line over the first 24 hours, but because IP addresses change, and why would they change? Okay, I've got a laptop. If my laptop is infected, it may have one IP address in my house in the morning when I'm drinking coffee. It may have another IP address when I go to a coffee shop and get more coffee later. My office, there's another one. And various networks have different latency for changing IP address. So it can have multiple IP addresses per day. If it's a stable device on a network, you may or may not get the same IP address every time you turn it on. So every network is going to have a different function. And that means that the longer that you count, the bigger the error. So whenever anyone gives you a count and they say, this is a count over the last 6 months of the total number of IP addresses, that number is not accurate. Use that to your advantage to make more accurate counts by making sure that you're talking about counts over very short periods of time. We don't really do consistent naming and use a taxonomy very well when talking about things, and the role matters, at least with the takedown, and this was Zeus that Microsoft did. In the court documents, you can go through and see tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, I don't know what the total number was, of here's an IP with a domain name and what it was. Was it involved in control? Was it involved in infection? It's one of the places that injects code into a HTML page. Is it the place that the keystroke logs, once captured, get deposited? Each one of those is different. And if you're looking at dealing with something on your network, if I'm looking at a network where I've got alerts saying Zeus bad because some IP address was on a blacklist and it came up saying this is related to Zeus, if it was trying to infect and I have WebSense or something that blocks it, then who cares? If it's command and control, or it's going out to try and get the dynamic configuration file to figure out who's supposed to be targeted, well, that's early. If it's sending the keystrokes out, and specifically that host that just did that is in the finance department, that's a really bad thing. You need to go spend some time and do some forensics. So if we start categorizing what are these alerts about, not just what malware, but what role, that will help. And it's probably safe to say that combining legal and technical means has a better result than just trying to do a technical takedown. And going back to the diagram that I had earlier, understanding the whole life cycle matters as well in calling whatever the operation was a success. Yeah, the Kelios guys took 108 or 120,000 IPs or infected hosts out of the control of the bad guys. But if they were infected with some other thing, including another dropper, they're in the pool that someone's going to come and say, I want to buy 100,000 infected hosts. I want you to put this code on them. And then automatically they're doing bad stuff again. So net, it might not have been a gain. There's one other really good benefit to the court action that Microsoft has been doing, and that is they are effectively doing a stakeholder analysis in order to go to court to get the court to agree that certain things should be done. Microsoft's not acting on their own, but I assisted them with some declarations in at least 2 of the cases, and those documents are there to explain to the court, here is how this specific malware functions. These are the types of things that are involved, the command and control servers, the malicious domains, what a domain generation algorithm is, and this is the instrumentality of crime that the bad guys are using. We are asking you to compel certain people to do things. If they're done in the right order, including some technical means, then this is the outcome that we will get. So there's some transparency in everything that's going on. That's not being seen very much with other takedown actions. There's just, yay, we took down the biggest botnet in the world, come buy our products or services, but not really going into what were the risks that they took into consideration when they made this action. How did they ensure that they were causing minimal harm? What were the fallbacks that they had? What other alternatives were there to try and meet the objective? And what was the objective? If the objective is just taking over the botnet, but it doesn't really stop the activity, is that a justifiable risk to be taking? And just having these discussions sometimes causes some strife. And so we need to have these discussions. If we can have them in private venues, fine. But we have to up the game, I think, if we're going to get more aggressive, if people really do want to start going after the bad guys on their own without law enforcement's involvement. There has to be a little bit more holding people to high standards in order to make sure that the outcome is something that the public is going to accept. If we say that we're doing this for the public's good and the public ends up getting harmed, we are going to get in trouble, because at some point, if the harm's big enough, laws will be passed making the things that we do illegal. It's already illegal to possess malicious software in certain European countries. Simple possession, not with intent, but just the possession of it. Think about if we all had to adhere to those kinds of standards. And there's a really good book here by Paul Taylor. It's kind of old, but he used a sociologist, he interviewed people in the computer underground, and he interviewed people in law enforcement and the mitigation communities, and compared and contrasted, how do they function? How do they communicate? How do they cooperate? How do they vet somebody into the group? What are their requirements for membership? And there's a huge difference between the way that the underground functions and the way that we function. And I see a lot of people saying, well, the bad guys don't have ethics, they don't care, they don't obey laws. All those things slow us down. They make it harder for us to do our job. Well, right. Because we adhere to laws, we have ethics and norms. We need to do a little bit harder job if we're going to try and do things, not just cut corners and make it easier to act the way that they're acting. So, we need to be aware that, yes, it costs us a lot more to do a good defensive job. They only have to be right once in some simple way to get in. We have to do a whole bunch of things. But it's really not as cheap and simple as a lot of people say to go strike back, because we've spent all that we can spend on the passive defense. That's not working. Now we have to go active. If you're making a shortcut and saying, I need to strike back because that's the cheap and easy thing to do, that's when we're going to start getting in trouble. So I think that's probably good. If there's time for any questions, I'll take some questions. I'll be hanging around having beers tonight, and I will put the slides and a couple of these other resources up on my website at that URL.
All right. Thank you very much, David.